They called her useless before the dust had time to settle. And out here, words like that didn't just sting. They stuck like burrs in a man's reputation for miles. Clara Whitfield stood in the middle of the loading platform with splintered wood at her boots and a broken crate bleeding flour into the dry wind. The white powder lifting into the air like smoke under the late afternoon sun. No one rushed to help her. No one ever did. Because this town had already decided what she was worth long. Before that crate slipped through her fingers, a few men leaned against the post rail, hats tipped low, watching like it was some kind of show, and somewhere behind them, a laugh cracked sharp and easy, the kind that spreads fast when it finds weakness. Ethan Cole stood 10 feet away, close enough to see the tremble in her hands, far enough to pretend he didn't, his boots planted in the dirt, arms loose at his sides, eyes steady but unreadable. He had the kind of stillness that made people think he didn't care, like nothing out here could move him anymore. Clara didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at the man shouting about lost goods or the ledger that didn't balance. She looked at Ethan, just once, just long enough to ask a question without speaking it. And for a moment, the wind seemed to hold its breath with her, because everyone knew if Ethan Cole spoke, things changed. That was the quiet truth of this place. But he didn't speak. He shifted his weight, turned slightly. And then he walked away, slow, deliberate, like a man leaving something behind on purpose. And that hurt worse than the laughter, worse than the accusation, worse than the way the foreman shook his head like she'd proven exactly what they'd always said, can't trust her with a simple load. He muttered, loud enough for the others to hear, loud enough to make it official. Clara bent down, brushing flour from her skirt with hands that refused to shake now, like she was gathering what little dignity hadn't already been taken from her. The sun dipped lower, throwing long shadows across the boards, and still no one helped. Not one hand reached out. Not one voice said her name like it meant something. And somewhere past the stables, a door creaked, a horse shifted. Life in the town went on like nothing had happened at all. Except something had, something quiet and heavy that settled into the space Ethan left behind. Because men like him didn't walk away without a reason. Not out here. Not after looking someone in the eye like that. Clara picked up the last broken piece of wood and set it aside, straightened her back, and said nothing. But the silence she carried with her felt different now, like a storm waiting just beyond the horizon, and no one in that yard, not the laughing men, not the foreman, not even Clara herself, understood yet what Ethan Cole had just set in motion by doing nothing at all. The town moved on before the dust even settled, because that is what towns like this do. They swallow moments whole and pretend nothing ever happened. But Clara Whitfield felt every step as she walked the length of Main Street with a canvas bag slung over her shoulder, lighter than it should have been, lighter than a life ought to feel. The boards creaked under her boots, each sound echoing louder than the voices that had filled the yard just an hour before. And behind those closed doors, behind those shaded windows, people were already telling the story in their own way, trimming it down to something simple, something easy. She dropped the crate. She proved them right. She was not worth the trouble. Clara kept her eyes forward, past the general store, past the water pump, past the hitching post where a stray horse flicked its tail against flies, because stopping meant listening, and listening meant believing. And she was not ready to do that yet. Not today, not after the way. Ethan Cole had looked at her like he understood something no one else did, and still chose to walk away. That part stayed with her, heavier than the bag, heavier than the silence. She reached the edge of town where the road stretched out in a long ribbon of dust and heat. Nothing but open land for miles. The kind of distance that makes people disappear without anyone asking where they went. She paused there, just for a second, just long enough to feel the wind shift against her face, carrying the faint smell of hay and sun-warmed wood, and something else beneath it, something sharper, like ink and paper and old secrets. Back in town, Ethan Cole did not go home. He did not stop at the saloon or the well, or any place a man might be expected to linger. Instead, he walked straight past the familiar paths and toward the office no one paid much attention to unless they had business they could not ignore. The land records office sat quiet in the late light, its doors slightly warped from years of heat and cold. The kind of place where time stacked up in ledgers and forgotten pages. Ethan stepped inside without knocking. The air cooler there, still, thick with dust that had settled into every corner. He moved with purpose, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain, like a man following a trail only he could see. His fingers traced along the shelves until they found what they were looking for, a ledger worn at the edges, heavier than it should have been. He pulled it free and set it on the desk, the sound low but final. Then he opened it, slow, careful, page after page turning under. His hand, numbers, dates, names, all written neat enough to pass a glance. But Ethan did not glance, he read, he studied, his eyes narrowing just slightly as the pieces settled into place. Outside, the sun dipped lower, stretching shadows long across the empty street. And back at the edge of town, Clara took one step forward onto the road that led away from everything she had known. But something in her chest held her there, something unfinished, like a question that had not been answered yet. Because men like Ethan Cole did not leave things half done, and if he had walked away, then it was not the end of the story, not for her, not for this town, and not for the truth that was still sitting, quiet and waiting, on a desk no one else had thought to open. Clara did not take the second step, not yet. Her boot hovered just above the dry earth as if the ground itself had something to say. And out here, when something felt unfinished, it usually was, she lowered her foot slowly, turning her head just enough to glance back at the town she had already decided to leave behind. The buildings looked smaller from this distance, quieter, like they were pretending innocence, like nothing inside them had ever raised a voice against her. But she knew better. She adjusted the strap on her shoulder and exhaled, long and steady. Then she stepped back off the road and onto the worn path that led along the outer fence line. Not returning, not yet leaving, just waiting, because waiting was something she had learned to do well. Back in the records office, Ethan Cole stood motionless for a moment with both hands resting on the open ledger, his eyes fixed on a column of numbers that did not add up the way they should. Not if the entries were honest, not if the man writing them had nothing to hide. He turned one more page, slower this time, and there it was again, the same pattern, shipments marked received but never accounted for, goods that vanished somewhere between arrival and storage, and always signed off by the same name. The same careful handwriting that had passed through this town unquestioned for years. Ethan closed the ledger halfway, not fully, just enough to mark the place, his jaw tightening in a way that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. Because Ethan was not a man who showed much, but when he did, it meant something had settled in a certainty. Outside, the sky shifted toward evening, the kind of golden light that made everything look softer than it really was. A wagon rolled slowly down the street, wheels creaking, a dog barked once then fell quiet. And still no one noticed the door to the records office open again. Ethan stepped out, with the ledger tucked under his arm, not hidden, not displayed, just carried like any other thing a man might own. But there was weight in it now, more than paper, more than ink. Across town, Clara reached the fence line and rested her hand on the rough wood, the grain worn smooth in places by years of passing hands. She traced it absently, eyes fixed on the horizon but not really seeing it, because her mind had already turned back, not to the laughter, not to the voices, but to that moment. When Ethan had looked at her and said nothing, there had been something in that silence, something deliberate, like a promise that had not been spoken yet. And Clara Whitfield was not the kind of woman who believed in empty gestures. She had lived too long on too little to mistake indifference for meaning, which meant if Ethan Cole had walked away, he had done it for a reason, and reasons out here had a way of catching up to people. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint sound of footsteps from behind her, slow, steady, familiar. Clara did not turn right away. She let the sound come closer, let it settle into certainty before she moved, because out here, you did not face something until you knew exactly what it was. And when she finally turned, the last light of day caught on the worn edges of a ledger tucked beneath a man's arm, and in that quiet space between them, before a single word was spoken, the truth had already begun to move. The space between them held longer than it should have, stretched thin by everything that had not been said back on that platform. Clara Whitfield did not step forward, and she did not step back. She simply watched Ethan Cole the way a person watches a storm forming in the distance, careful, measured, waiting to see if it would pass or break. Ethan stopped a few feet away, close enough now that the last light caught the lines in his face, the dust on his coat, the weight in his eyes that had not been there before, Or maybe it had and no one had looked close enough to notice. He did not greet her, did not offer apology. Men like him rarely did either. Instead, he shifted the ledger from under his arm and held it out slightly, not fully extended, just enough to make a point without forcing it. Clara's gaze dropped to it for a moment. The worn edges, the faint crease where it had been opened and closed too many times. Then back to him. "You waited," she said quietly, her voice steady but carrying something sharp beneath it. Not anger, not exactly, something more controlled than that. Ethan gave a small nod, not defensive, not proud, just certain. "Had to be sure," he replied, his voice low, the kind that did not rise unless it needed to. Clara let that sit between them, let the words settle into place, because out here, being sure often came too late for people like her. She glanced back toward the town. The rooftops now, fading into shadow. "They already decided," she said, more to the air than to him. Ethan followed her gaze for a second, then looked back at her. "They decided on what they saw," he said, "not on what is written." He tapped the ledger lightly with one finger, a small sound, but it carried. Clara studied him, searching for something in his face, regret, maybe, or doubt. But there was none, only that same stillness, deeper now, like something had locked into place inside him. "You could have said something," she said after a moment, not accusing, just stating what was true. Ethan did not flinch. "If I spoke then," he said, "they would have argued, twisted it, turned it into noise." He paused, just long enough for the wind to move between them. "This," he lifted the ledger slightly, "this does not argue." Clara's fingers tightened slightly around the strap of her bag. She understood that kind of thinking, even if she did not like the cost of it. Silence as a tool, not as surrender. She took a step closer, just one, enough to see the page where the book naturally fell open. Rows of numbers, names she recognized, dates that lined up too neatly with shipments that had gone missing. The pattern was there if you looked, and now she was looking, really looking. The truth was not loud. It never was. It sat quiet in ink and waited for someone willing to read it. Clara exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing just enough to matter. "And now?" she asked. Ethan closed the ledger halfway, not hiding it, just marking the moment. "Now they listen," he said, and for the first time since she had known him, there was something in his voice that felt almost like finality, not loud, not forceful, but certain in a way that made the air shift. Back in town, a lantern flickered to life in the office window, someone moving inside, unaware that the story they thought was finished had only just begun to turn. And out on that quiet stretch of land, with the last light fading, and the first stars beginning to show, Clara Whitfield realized she had not been left behind. She had been given time, and Ethan Cole had not walked away from her. He had walked towards something no one else had thought to see. The night did not fall all at once. It settled slowly over the town like a quiet decision, lanterns flickering to life one by one, casting warm circles of light that did little to soften the weight hanging in the air. Clara Whitfield walked beside Ethan Cole now, not behind him and not ahead, just beside. The distance between them measured but no longer uncertain. The ledger rested in his hand, steady, like it belonged there, like it had always been waiting for this moment. The road back into town felt different than the one she had just left. The same dust, the same buildings, but something beneath it had shifted, something unseen but undeniable. Near the center of town, voices drifted from the saloon, low and careless, the kind of laughter that comes easy when a story feels finished, when people believe they have already chosen the ending. Clara slowed as they approached the main street, her eyes scanning the familiar places. The general store, the post office, the loading platform where everything had started. The broken crate had been cleared away, the flowers swept aside like it had never existed. But she remembered. She would always remember. Ethan did not slow. His steps remained even, deliberate, carrying him straight toward the office where decisions were recorded and forgotten just as easily. A lantern burned inside now, the glow steady behind the glass. Someone was still working, still writing numbers that did not belong. Ethan stopped just outside the door, not hesitating, just marking the moment. Clara stood a half step behind him, her hand tightening slightly at her side, not from fear, but from the weight of what was about to unfold. Inside, the scrape of a chair echoed faintly, followed by the soft shuffle of paper, ordinary sounds, the kind that never drew attention. Until they did, Ethan pushed the door open without force, just enough for it to swing inward on its own. The hinges creaking softly in the quiet, the man inside looked up, surprised more by the interruption than anything else. His pen paused mid-line, ink still fresh on the page. His eyes moved from Ethan to Clara and back again, calculating, measuring, trying to understand why they had returned instead of leaving, because in his mind, this matter had already been settled, already filed away as truth. Ethan stepped inside first, the wood beneath his boots sounding louder than it should have. Clara followed, closing the door behind her with a soft click that seemed to seal the room from the rest of the world. For a moment, no one spoke. The lantern light flickered slightly, casting shadows that shifted across the walls, across the desk, across the open books that had hidden their secrets in plain sight. Ethan set the ledger down on the desk, not carefully, not carelessly, just with intent. The sound it made was solid. Final. The man's eyes dropped to it immediately, recognition flashing for just a second before he masked it with something else, something practiced, something controlled. "You are back," he said, his voice even, but thinner than before. Clara remained silent, her gaze fixed on the ledger, on the pages that had quietly rewritten her fate without her ever being asked. Ethan did not sit, did not lean. He simply rested his hand on the book and spoke in that same low, steady tone. "We need to go over your records." And in that moment, the quiet room held more weight than the entire town outside, because this was no longer about what people believed. It was about what could be proven, and the truth, once placed on the table, does not ask for permission to be seen. The man behind the desk did not reach for the ledger right away, and that hesitation spoke louder than anything he could have said. His fingers hovered above the paper he had been writing on, ink still wet, as if finishing that line might somehow protect him from what sat in front of him now. Ethan Cole did not move his hand from the ledger, did not press it forward or pull it back. He simply waited, because waiting, when you already knew the truth, was not weakness. It was pressure, slow and steady, the kind that forced a man to reveal himself without a single raised voice. Clara Whitfield stood near the door, her posture straight, her presence quiet but no longer small. She watched the man the way she had learned to watch everything in this town, not for what he said, but for what he tried not to show. His eyes flicked once more to the worn edges of the book, then back to Ethan, a thin smile forming, practiced, familiar. "There is nothing in those pages you have not already seen before," he said, his tone even, but lacking the ease it carried earlier in the day. Ethan gave a slight nod, acknowledging the words without agreeing to them. "That is true," he said, his voice calm, "but it matters who is reading them." The room fell still again, the lantern flame shifting just enough to cast a longer shadow across the desk. The man's smile faltered, just for a second, and in that second, Clara saw it, the crack in the certainty he had worn so comfortably before. Ethan opened the ledger to the marked page, turning it so the man could see clearly, not shoving it forward, not forcing him, just placing the truth where it could not be ignored. "Shipments listed here," Ethan said, tapping lightly beside a column of numbers, "arrived on dates that matched the records from the rail office." His finger moved down the page, steady, precise. "But they do not appear in the storage logs." The man leaned back slightly in his chair, crossing his arms as if distance might create doubt. "Clerical errors happen," he replied, but the words sounded thinner now, less certain. Ethan did not argue, did not raise his voice. He simply turned another page, revealing the same pattern, again and again, consistent in a way mistakes never were. "Errors do not repeat like this," Ethan said, and the quiet weight of that statement settled over the room. Clara stepped forward then, just one step, enough to stand beside the desk, her eyes moving across the pages, seeing now what she had never been allowed to see before. The truth had always been here, written plainly, hidden not by complexity, but by assumption. No one had questioned it because no one had needed to, until now. The man's gaze shifted between them, calculating, searching for a way out that did not exist in ink. "Even if that were true," he said slowly, "it does not change what happened today." His eyes flicked toward Clara, dismissive, trying to pull the story back to where it had been easier to control. But Clara did not lower her gaze this time, did not step back. She held that look, steady and unbroken, and for the first time, there was no doubt in it. Ethan closed the ledger halfway, not to end the conversation, but to narrow it, to bring it to a point. It changes everything, he said quietly, and outside, beyond the closed door, the town carried on, unaware that inside this small room, the version of truth it had accepted so easily was beginning to come apart, not with noise, not with force, but with something far more dangerous out here, certainty. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling into the corners of the room like dust that had been waiting years to be disturbed. The man behind the desk shifted in his chair, not dramatically, just enough to remind himself he was still in control, or at least he believed he was. His fingers tapped once against the wood, a quiet rhythm that did not quite find its pace. "You are making something out of nothing," he said, slower now, choosing each word with care, as if careful words might rebuild what was already slipping. Ethan Cole did not respond right away. He let the statement sit, let it stretch thin under its own weight. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded paper, worn at the edges, handled more than once. He placed it beside the ledger, not overlapping, just close enough to connect them without needing explanation. The man's eyes dropped to it despite himself. Recognition flickering again, quicker this time, harder to hide. Clara. Whitfield watched that flicker, and in it, she saw more truth than anything written on the page. Ethan unfolded the paper slowly, revealing a receipt stamped from the rail office, the ink dark and official, dates matching the entries in the ledger, quantities listed clearly, shipments that had arrived and been signed for, but never stored, never accounted for beyond that moment. "Different source," Ethan said quietly, his finger resting beside the stamp. "Same numbers." The man leaned forward, slightly now, drawn in despite his effort to remain distant. His eyes moved between the receipt and the ledger, searching for a flaw, for something he could point to and unravel the connection. But the pattern held, steady, undeniable. Clara took another step closer, not to confront, not to accuse, but to see, really see. Her gaze moved across the documents, following the line of truth from one page to the next. And for the first time, she understood how easily a lie could live in plain sight when no one thought to question it. "You are saying I misplaced goods," the man said, a faint edge creeping into his voice now, not loud, but present. Ethan shook his head once, slow, deliberate. "No," he replied. "I am saying they never reached where they were supposed to." The distinction hung there, sharper than any accusation, because it did not tell him what he had done. It told him what could be proven, and that was harder to deny. Outside, a gust of wind brushed against the building, rattling the window just enough to be heard, a reminder that the world beyond this room still moved, still turned, unaware of the shift happening inside. Clara lifted her eyes from the pages and looked at the man, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something steadier, something earned. "You said it did not change what happened today," she said, her voice calm, clear. "But it does." She let that settle, then added, "Because it was never about me." The man's jaw tightened, his posture straightening as if bracing against something he could no longer push aside. Ethan closed the ledger again, this time fully, not ending the matter, but sealing it into something complete, something ready to be carried beyond this room. "Tomorrow morning," Ethan said, "these go to the council." No threat in his tone, no force, just a statement of what would happen next. And in that moment, the room shifted again. The balance no longer where it had been. The man behind the desk sat very still, because he understood what that meant, not just for the records, not just for the missing goods, but for every word spoken earlier that day. Every judgment passed too quickly, and as the lantern flickered once more, casting long shadows across the closed ledger, it became clear that the truth had already stepped outside, and by morning, the town would have no choice but to see it. Morning did not arrive gently. It came with the kind of clarity that leaves no room for doubt. The sun rising sharp over the rooftops, cutting long lines of light across the town as if drawing attention to everything people had hoped would stay unnoticed. Clara Whitfield stood near the edge of the main street, not hidden, not stepping forward, just present, and that alone was enough to draw eyes. Because she was not supposed to still be here. Not after yesterday. Not after the way the story had ended in everyone's mind. Voices began low, quiet murmurs passing from one person to another, glances shifting, questions forming but not yet spoken. Ethan Cole walked beside her, the ledger in his hand again, not displayed like a weapon, not concealed like a secret, just carried, steady and certain. They moved toward the council building where decisions were made official, where words turned into records that could not be undone as easily as they were spoken. The door stood open, a few men already inside, drawn by something they did not yet understand, but could feel moving through the town like a change in weather. Clara noticed how their voices lowered as she passed, how their eyes lingered a second longer than before, not with judgment this time, but with something closer to uncertainty inside. The room smelled of old wood and paper. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as people shifted, making space without quite knowing why. Ethan stepped forward, placing the ledger on the table at the center of the room, the same way he had the night before, deliberate, final. The sound echoed just enough to quiet the remaining whispers. One of the councilmen leaned forward, brows drawn, his fingers brushing the edge of the book as if testing its weight before opening it. "What is this about?" he asked, his voice measured but carrying the authority of someone used to being answered. Ethan did not raise his voice, did not fill the room with explanation. "It is about what was missed," he said simply. The councilman opened the ledger, his eyes moving across the pages, slower at first, then stopping, then moving again, faster now, connecting pieces that had been written plainly but never questioned. Another man stepped closer, looking over his shoulder, then another. The room tightening around the table as the truth began to take shape in silence. Clara remained where she stood, not stepping into the circle, not needing to, because this part did not belong to her anymore. This was no longer about proving herself. It was about revealing what had been hidden behind her name. A chair creaked as someone shifted back, a quiet exhale following. The kind that comes when certainty gives way to something else, something heavier. The councilman closed the ledger halfway, his expression no longer neutral, no longer distant. "These entries," he began, then paused, choosing his words carefully now. "They do not align." Ethan gave a small nod, nothing more, because the pages were already speaking. Clara watched the room change, not in noise, not in sudden reaction, but in the way men stopped leaning back and started leaning forward, in the way their eyes no longer dismissed but examined, in the way silence became something different, something that demanded attention instead of ignoring it. Outside, the town continued to stir, unaware that inside those walls, the story they had told themselves was being rewritten without a single raised voice. And as the morning light filled the room completely, washing over the ledger, the table, and the faces gathered around it, it became clear that what had begun as a quiet accusation against one woman was now something far larger, something that could not be folded away or swept aside, because truth, once opened, does not close itself again. The room did not erupt. It tightened, like a rope pulled 1 inch too far. The councilmen stood closer now, shoulders nearly touching as they leaned over the table. Each page turned slower than the last, not because the numbers were hard to read, but because what they meant was harder to accept. One man cleared his throat but said nothing. Another adjusted his hat as if that small movement might steady the shift happening beneath his feet. Ethan Cole remained where he stood, hands relaxed at his sides, his part already done, because once the truth was placed in front of men like these, it was no longer his to carry. Clara Whitfield watched from the edge of the room, the same place she had stood all morning, not hidden, not central, just present, and for the first time since she had arrived in this town, no one looked through her as if she were not there. Their eyes moved past her, then returned, uncertain, measuring again what they thought they understood. One of the councilmen finally straightened, closing the ledger slowly, his fingers lingering on the cover as if he wished it could close on its own and take everything with it. "These records," he said, his voice lower now, less certain than before. "They suggest a pattern." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to, because everyone in that room could already see it. The pattern was not in question, only what it meant for the man who had written it. A chair shifted behind them as another official stepped forward, glancing at the receipt Ethan had placed beside the ledger, comparing, aligning, confirming without needing to speak the conclusion aloud. Clara's gaze moved across the faces in the room. She saw it there, not guilt, not yet, but something closer to recognition, the quiet realization that they had chosen the wrong story too quickly, that they had filled in the blanks without ever checking what was written in ink. Outside, voices gathered near the doorway, townspeople drawn by the stillness inside, by the absence of argument where they expected it. Curiosity moved faster than truth, but truth followed close behind. The door remained open now, and a few figures stood just beyond the threshold, hats in hand, listening without stepping fully inside. The councilman who had spoken earlier turned slightly toward Ethan, his expression searching for something more, an explanation, perhaps, or a direction. But Ethan offered neither. He simply met the man's gaze and held it, steady, unshaken, because this was not his judgment to pass, only his to reveal. The councilman nodded once, small, almost reluctant, then looked toward the others, and in that silent exchange, something shifted again, not dramatic, not loud, but final in a way that could not be undone. Clara felt it without needing to hear it spoken. The weight that had been placed on her the day before, heavy and certain, had begun to lift, not because someone had defended her, but because the truth had replaced the lie, and lies do not hold when they are no longer supported. One of the men near the doorway stepped back, then another, the murmur outside growing just enough to carry, questions forming now, no longer about Clara, but about something else entirely, something larger. Inside, the councilman opened the ledger once more, not to search, but to confirm what had already been found, and when he looked up again, his voice carried a different tone, not authority, not doubt, but something closer to responsibility. "We will need to address this properly," he said, and though the words were simple, they marked the moment clearly, because the story had shifted, the focus had moved, and for the first time since the accusation had been spoken, Clara Whitfield was no longer at the center of it. She stood in the same place, under the same light, in the same room, but everything around her had changed, and as the morning stretched forward, quiet and undeniable, the town began to understand that what they had called useless had never been the truth. It had only been the easiest thing to believe. No one raised their voice, and that was what made it final. The councilman who held the ledger did not slam it shut or call for order. He simply placed it flat on the table and rested his hand over it, as if to keep it from slipping away, and in that small, quiet motion, the decision had already begun to take shape. The men around him exchanged glances that no longer carried doubt but consequence, because what lay in those pages was not rumor, not assumption, it was record, and records out here had a way of outliving excuses. Ethan Cole stepped back then, not dramatically, just one step, enough to remove himself from the center of the room. His part done, his presence no longer needed to hold the truth in place. Clara Whitfield noticed it immediately, the way he shifted away without waiting for acknowledgement, without waiting for anyone to say he was right, because that had never been the point. She watched him for a second longer than she meant to, then turned her attention back to the table where the weight of the morning had settled. One of the councilmen cleared his throat again, but this time he spoke with direction, not hesitation. "We will review every entry," he said, his voice steady, "and we will speak with the rail office directly." Another man nodded, adding quietly, "And the storage logs," each word placed carefully, like they were rebuilding something they had allowed to collapse, near the doorway. The small crowd that had gathered shifted closer, not entering, but no longer holding back either. The story had changed, and people could feel it without needing it explained. Clara stood still, her hands resting at her sides, no longer gripping the strap of her bag, no longer bracing against what might come next, because for the first time since the accusation, nothing was coming for her. The focus had moved completely, one of. The councilman finally looked toward her, really looked this time, not through her, not past her, but at her, his expression not apologetic, not yet, but aware, and awareness was the first step out here, even if it came late. "Miss Whitfield," he began, then stopped, the rest of the sentence catching somewhere between intention and admission. Clara held his gaze, steady, not demanding anything, not offering anything either. because she understood something now that the room was just beginning to learn. Truth did not need to be defended once it was seen. It simply remained. The councilman gave a small nod, as if acknowledging that unspoken understanding, then turned back to the ledger, the work ahead already clear in his mind. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, filling the street with light that left no shadows deep enough to hide in. The murmurs spread faster now, carried from one person to another, not about Clara, not about a dropped crate or a mistake, but about records, about numbers, about something that had been wrong for longer than anyone had noticed. Ethan reached the doorway without looking back, his boots steady against the wood, the same quiet rhythm as always. Clara watched him go, not with confusion this time, not with hurt, but with a kind of understanding that settled deeper than words, because she saw now what he had done, not just in the office, not just with the ledger, but in the moment he had chosen silence. He had not abandoned her. He had waited until the truth could stand on its own. And out here, that was the only kind of justice that lasted. Inside the room, the councilman leaned in again, voices low, focused, no longer dismissing, no longer certain of the story they had told themselves the day before. And as the ledger lay open beneath their hands, no longer ignored, it became clear that the town would not remember Clara Whitfield as they had tried to define her. They would remember this morning instead, the moment when the truth did not shout, did not argue, but simply appeared and refused to be moved. By midday, the town no longer pretended nothing had happened. The change moved through it like heat rising off the ground, slow but impossible to ignore. Clara Whitfield walked down Main Street without lowering her gaze, and that alone altered the way people stepped aside, not out of respect yet, but out of something closer to reconsideration. Conversations paused as she passed, then resumed in quieter tones, no longer certain, no longer careless, because the story they had told themselves had begun to unravel, and no one wanted to be caught holding the wrong version of it. At the far end of the street, near the loading platform where everything had started, a few men stood gathered, their voices low, their eyes shifting toward the council building and back again. Uncertainty sat heavier on them than judgment ever had. Clara did not stop. She did not need to return to that place. Not anymore. She moved past it like it belonged to yesterday, because in a way, it did. Inside the council room, the ledger remained open, pages turned and marked, men moving in and out with papers in hand, messengers already sent toward the rail office. The process unfolding not with urgency, but with inevitability. Ethan Cole stood near the back wall, not involved in the discussion, not offering direction, simply present in the way a man is when he has already done what needed to be done. One of the councilmen approached him briefly, speaking in a low voice, but Ethan only nodded once, his expression unchanged, and the man moved on, because there was nothing more to be asked of him. The truth had already been placed where it could not be ignored. Clara paused just outside the doorway, not entering, not yet. She could hear the murmur of voices inside, steady, focused, no longer dismissive. And for a moment, she let herself listen, not to the words, but to the tone. The difference between yesterday and now was not loud, but it was real. She stepped away again, choosing the quiet of the street over the weight of that room, because this part no longer required her presence. Near the well, an older woman who had once turned away from her now hesitated as Clara approached. Their eyes met for a brief second, and in that second, something unspoken passed between them. Not apology, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement, small but undeniable. Clara gave a slight nod and continued on. The wind carried the faint scent of dust and sun-warmed wood, familiar, steady, unchanged even as everything else shifted. Behind her, the town continued to adjust, to realign itself with what had been revealed, not all at once, not cleanly, but piece by piece, because truth rarely settles quickly. It lingers, it reshapes, it forces people to look again at what they thought they understood, and in that looking, things begin to change. At the edge of town, the road stretched out the same as it had that morning, wide and empty, offering distance to anyone who needed it. Clara stopped there once more, not because she had to decide again, but because she could. The choice felt different now, no longer driven by necessity, no longer pushed by voices behind her, but held in her own hands. She looked back once, not at the people, not at the buildings, but at the space itself, the place where she had been judged, dismissed, and then quietly proven otherwise, and for the first time, it did not feel like something she needed to leave behind. Inside the council building, a decision was forming, not spoken yet, but close, the kind that would not only correct what had been written, but reshape what had been believed. And as the sun climbed higher, steady and unyielding, Clara Whitfield stood between the road ahead and the town behind her, no longer defined by either, but by something far quieter and far stronger. The simple fact that the truth had found its way to the surface, and it had done so without her needing to raise her voice at all. The afternoon settled into a slower rhythm, the kind that follows after something has already been decided but not yet spoken aloud. Clara Whitfield remained at the edge of town, the same place where the road offered distance and the wind carried nothing but open land ahead. Yet she did not move, not because she was unsure, but because for the first time, there was no urgency pushing her forward. Behind her, the town continued to shift in small, quiet ways, doors opening and closing, voices lowering when they spoke her name, not out of dismissal now, but caution, because people had begun to understand that they had been wrong, and being wrong out here carried its own weight. Inside the council building, the final pieces had come together, the rail office confirmation had arrived, numbers matched, signatures aligned, the pattern no longer something to debate, but something to accept. The councilman stood around the table, not in argument, not in confusion, but in agreement, the kind that does not need to be announced because it is already understood by everyone present. One of them closed the ledger with both hands this time, not halfway, not carefully, but firmly, as if sealing it into something complete, something that would now move beyond this room. "It is clear," he said, his voice carrying through the open doorway and into the street, not loud, but steady enough to travel. A few people outside turned toward the sound, listening without stepping closer, because they already knew what was coming next. Ethan Cole stood near the wall again, the same quiet position he had held all day, his eyes lifting only slightly as the words were spoken, not surprised, not relieved, just acknowledging what had always been inevitable once the truth was placed where it could be seen. Clara heard it too, carried on the wind, those two simple words, and something inside her settled, not rising, not reacting, just settling into place like a stone finding its rest at the bottom of a river. She turned then, slowly, her gaze moving back toward the town, not searching, not questioning, just seeing it as it was now, changed in ways that would not be spoken openly, but would be felt in every glance, every pause, every word chosen more carefully than before. One of the councilmen stepped out onto the porch, his posture different now, less certain of himself, more aware of what his words would carry. His eyes found Clara where she stood, and for a moment, he hesitated, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood that saying it would not undo what had already been done. Clara held his gaze, steady, calm, giving him the space to speak if he chose to, but not needing it from him. Not anymore. The man gave a slight nod instead, a quiet acknowledgement that carried more weight than any apology might have. Then he turned back inside, because the work was not finished. It had only changed direction. Ethan stepped out a moment later, the sunlight catching on the dust along his coat. He did not look at Clara right away. He simply stood beside her, the same measured distance as before, but without the tension that had filled it yesterday. "They will correct the record," he said, his voice low, certain. Clara nodded once, her eyes still on the town. "Records can be corrected," she replied, her tone even. "People take longer." Ethan did not disagree. He rarely did when something was true. The wind moved between them again, carrying the quiet sounds of a town learning something it had not wanted to learn, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because nothing needed to be added. The truth had already done its work, not loudly, not forcefully, but completely, and as the sun began its slow descent toward evening, Clara Whitfield stood not as someone who had been defended, but as someone who had been revealed, and out here, that was the only kind of justice that ever truly remained. The evening came back to the town the same way it always did, slow, quiet, without asking permission, the light stretching long across the street before fading into that familiar gold that softened everything it touched. Clara Whitfield stood where the road met the edge of town. But this time, she did not feel like she was standing between two choices. She felt like she was standing on something solid, something that had been there all along, just buried under voices that had spoken too quickly and listened too little. Behind her, the town moved differently now, not loudly, not all at once, but in small ways that mattered. A man who had once laughed now tipped his hat as he passed, unsure of himself but trying. A woman who had turned away the day before paused long enough to meet Clara's eyes and hold them for a second longer than before. Not apology, not forgiveness, just recognition. And sometimes, out here, that was the beginning of something better than words. Ethan Cole stood a few feet away, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his gaze on the horizon rather than the town, like a man who never needed to see the change to know it had happened. Clara glanced at him, not searching for answers anymore, just acknowledging the quiet role he had played in something that would outlast both of them. "You could have spoken yesterday," she said, her voice calm, not questioning, just marking the truth one last time. Ethan did not turn right away. He let the wind pass between them, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant hay. Then he nodded once. "It would have been louder," he said, "but it would not have lasted." Clara considered that, the weight of it settling in the same way everything else had today, steady, undeniable. She looked back at the town one more time, not with hesitation, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet understanding that had not been there before. This place had not changed overnight. People rarely did, but something inside it had shifted, something that would stay, because it had been forced to see itself clearly. And that kind of seeing does not fade easily. She adjusted the strap on her shoulder, but this time it was not because she was preparing to leave. It was simply habit. The bag felt lighter now, though nothing inside it had changed, because the weight she had carried had never been in the canvas. It had been in the way others had looked at her, and that had been lifted without a single raised voice. Ethan finally turned then, his eyes meeting hers briefly, not lingering, not searching, just acknowledging. And in that small moment, there was no need for anything more. No thanks, no explanation, no promise, because what had been done did not belong to either of them alone. It belonged to the truth that had been allowed to stand. Clara took a step, not away from the town, not toward it, just forward, into whatever came next, and for the first time, that next step did not feel like escape. It felt like choice. Behind her, the town would go on. It always did, but it would go on differently, shaped by something quiet and lasting, something that had not needed force or noise to take hold. And as the last light faded and the first stars began to show, the lesson settled into the space between what had happened and what would come after. Out here, a person could be called anything by those who did not look closely. But names did not last when the truth was given time to speak. And sometimes, the strongest thing a person could do was not to fight back, not to shout louder, but to wait and let the truth arrive in its own time, steady as the sunset, certain as the morning that follows.